Ugh, haven't whipped out one of these in a while. The Space Pirates. I know. Okay, let's back up a bit. Robert Holmes, arguably the most acclaimed writer of Doctor Who's 20th century run, script editor during Philip Hinchcliffe's highly celebrated reign as producer, and essentially responsible for some of the most defining elements and moments of the entire franchise. His credits, including the likes of Spearhead from Space, The Time Warrior, The Ark in Space, The Deadly Assassin, The Talons of Weng-Chiang, and The Caves of Androzani, are widely cherished as some of the highest caliber scripts of the classic series, and he left a towering legacy on the show, particularly for how he helped to creatively shape the tenures of the 3rd and early 4th Doctors. But everyone has a blemish on their record, and not all of Holmes's output is adored. You'd be hard-pressed to find claims that The Power of Kroll or The Mysterious Planet are some of his finest work, for instance. Same for his debut story The Crotons, which I've covered on the channel before. But then there's his second serial, The Space Pirates. The Space Pirates is, in the eyes of fan consensus, a flop, widely considered to be the uncontested bottom of the barrel not only for Holmes's Doctor Who output, but potentially for the Second Doctor era and the 1960s decade as a whole. It's renowned as one of the absolute worst offerings from the classic series, to the point where its reputation ends up not only preceding, but outright eclipsing itself. It often falls unfavourably low in polls, both official and otherwise. Patrick Troughton himself disliked it, according to his biography. Even fellow Whoniversals member Nick Payne hates it.
Thank you, Will. Yes, sadly, The Space Pirates is my least favourite Doctor Who story of all time. Not that there's no good things in it, like episodes 4 to 6 are slightly better than the first 3, and the character of Madeline's pretty good, and the main 3 leads, of course. Unfortunately, the story's just not good in almost any sense. It's really dull, really boring, really slow, very sluggish. The first 2 episodes are barely anything. You've got Milo Clancy, who's really annoying and kind of pointless. It's not really that interesting, and it's 6 episodes long. It's a freaking drag. Yeah, this story, this is so bad.
Thank you, Nick. I've certainly taken pot shots at it myself in the past for being an unwelcome plateau in what was otherwise my favourite period of the show. I could argue for the merits of the Crotons, the Underwater Menace, the Wheel in Space, even the Dominators on a good day, but the Space Pirates? That was the one Second Doctor story I could never stand up for. But if you asked me why, I admit my reasoning was always quite dismissive and frivolous. I'd simply write it off as an unengaging, highly padded, sparsely plotted affair where the Doctor is barely involved, and that sentiment seemed to be shared by most of the people I knew and fandom at large. But is it really that simple? Did Robert Holmes just clock out on his second installment? Well, let's find out. Let's be impartial and give the Space Pirates an open-minded rewatch. Oh, starting in the middle of the action, are we? Wait, episode 2? What happened to part 1? Oh yeah. It's one of these, isn't it? Yeah, let's acknowledge the elephant in the room. The Space Pirates is a victim of the BBC's archival purging practices. 5 of its 6 episodes no longer exist as originally broadcast. All that remains of these lost episodes are the complete yet muffled audio tracks, a short selection of film trims, some scant production photos, and that's about it. Certainly not a flattering condition to be scrutinised under. This is a devil's advocate argument that comes up in defence of the Space Pirates. Whether it's fair to judge the serial when the intended viewing experience has been rendered largely inaccessible. It's a fair point, but also a nuanced one. I think it's still possible to reasonably gauge the quality of a script despite it being robbed of its visual language. Marco Polo, The Power of the Daleks, and Fury from the Deep are still right rightfully among the most celebrated classic serials despite not having a single surviving episode between them. That said, not all missing stories are on a level playing field in that regard, and the lack of visuals can absolutely hinder how we as the audience receive the work. Case in point, the glowing re-evaluation that The Enemy of the World had in the wake of its recovery. The decades of lukewarm shrugs it had previously garnered melting away in the face of its stellar direction and striking cinematography. It's entirely possible that we're stuck with a similar problem with The Space Pirates. The absence of footage is just inherently affecting our perception of it. I used to doubt this idea. I've always been good at engaging with missing episodes, no matter how challenging their surviving state was to digest. Your boy was 11 years old with ADHD watching muffled, pixelated-ass loose cannon reconstructions of Galaxy 4 before episode 3 had even been recovered, and I was glued to the screen from beginning to end. So I figured that the reason why The Space Pirates was the rare 60s story that I always failed to engage with was because it truly was just bad. Not offensively bad. There isn't any heinous character assassination or blatant illogical plotting. No, it's just bland, empty space filler. Bob Holmes phoned in 6 flimsy scripts and called it a day. They got the reputation they deserved, and the episodes becoming missing is entirely incidental to that. Stands to reason, right? Hell, 1 episode exists and is still dull. Well, that all changed for me when I started collecting the Second Doctor Target novelizations. You know, because I'm me. And when I cozied up with my copy of The Space Pirates, curious to experience the adventure through a different medium, I realised something. I liked it. And bear in mind, this wasn't some drastic narrative reimagining, nor was the prose itself, courtesy of Terrance Dicks, particularly innovative. It's pretty much beat for beat how it played out on TV, and fairly standard writing for the target range. But the inherent transformative differences that come with reading these events unfold on the page, as opposed to watching a static slideshow that can only convey so much at a set pace, really cleared up much of the dull fog which had always shrouded this plot for me. I was curious how this newfound perspective would shift my stance on the actual serial, so I rewatched the reconstructions, and I get it. I'm not saying it's a great story, nor that my experience of reappraising it would necessarily be universal, but this experience helped me gain a better understanding of what Holmes wrote here, and why it seems to be tough for many to digest. So, The Space Pirates is noteworthy for not featuring a monster of the week or alien menace, so to speak, putting it out of step with broader expectations many have of the Second Doctor's era, not unlike The Enemy of the World actually. Instead, we've got some good old-fashioned human criminality going on in a futuristic setting, with healthy doses of attempted murder, blackmail, kidnapping, and of course, the titular piracy. With a premise like Space Pirates, it's probably natural to contrast it with later, more overtly swashbuckling cracks at the concept like The Pirate Planet or Enlightenment, but in this case you may need to adjust your expectations. Stylistically speaking, this serial hews way closer to something like Jerry Anderson than it evokes archetypical piracy, and while hardly devoid of levity, it's played pretty straight for the most part. Additionally, this story is a slow burn, even by classic Who standards. In fact, The Space Pirates is at such a simmer that many may argue it's effectively raw. The narrative unfolds so gradually here, especially in the first half, with the characters' movements and associated plot developments occurring at a notably languid tempo. This isn't inherently a bad thing. I personally relish a 6-parter that takes its time to be thorough, but I wouldn't argue if you said this instance was excessive. The common opinion is that this serial is needlessly padded, seemingly out of obligation to meet the episode quota rather than naturally earning this length, something that Holmes would go on to tacitly confirm. And when looking at how parts of the story play out, yeah, it's an understandable criticism. Broadly speaking, episode 1 can come off as repetitive, showcasing the same prolonged inciting incident of Cavan's criminal gang plundering a sequence of government space beacons while the authorities consistently fail to to apprehend them. Episode 2, the surviving installment, also happens to have the least momentum, borderline halting proceedings to focus on establishing characters like Milo Clancy and Madeline Asigri through long and very exposition-heavy conversation scenes, and it takes until about halfway through the adventure for most of the story's key players to convene at the main setting, at which point the sense of escalation is still incredibly embryonic. Point is, even when looking at it charitably, I'd still concede that this certainly isn't Holmes's most streamlined script in terms of pacing, and this is only emphasized further with the visuals having been stripped away. However, when it comes to atmosphere, I actually think it's got something good going here. The lax pacing allows many scenes to establish a desolate mood pretty effectively, whether it be the yawning emptiness of the vacuum of space, the cabin fever of the beacons, or the grimness of the Argonite mineshafts. The production is a big help there, particularly the stellar model work and score, but still, credit where it's due. As for the characters and the conflict itself, it's often largely written off as tedious, uninteresting schlock, but honestly, I dare say there's some fairly good stuff to dig into here. Especially if you're a fan of Holmes's particular craft, as there's some distinctive attributes among this cast which would go on to become staples of his writing for Doctor Who later down the line. Milo Clancy, for instance, seems to be of an especially acquired taste, blurring the line between being an extremely obnoxious and stubborn Western caricature and being the endlessly charismatic, idiosyncratic beating heart of the adventure whose shabby old-fashioned sensibilities bounce off this futuristic world in really endearing ways. But he possesses an indignant, somewhat bumbling charm that would later resurface in characters like Vorg and Henry Gordon Jago, while also planting the seeds of a lovable rogue bravado that would fully blossom in Garon and Sabalom Glitz. And our antagonist Maurice Cavan is quite emblematic of Holmes's penchant for illicit, self-serving, morally corrupt villains. I dig his callous edge, with him stooping to some deliciously ruthless lows to protect his operations. The hints and eventual reveal of Madeline's underhanded partnership with him are a bit obvious, but her conflicted feelings towards the whole affair and his twisted means of maintaining a hold over her make for some compelling drama in the latter half. He wouldn't be too out of place among the cast of, say, The Caves of Androzani 15 years later. I don't know, I guess I just find it retroactively interesting to see Holmes warming up his character archetypes for the show. The weak link is probably the Space Corps, generally speaking. Not that there isn't good stuff with them. General Hermack's well-spoken sense of authority contrasting his single-minded approach and flawed conjecture is neat characterization, but their involvement just isn't as dynamic as it could have been, as after heavily front-loading the serial, Hermack's suspicion of Clancy being the pirate ringleader sends the Space Corps into a largely off-screen goose chase to an unseen homeworld that is largely told to us instead of shown, and they struggle to regain prominence in the story until the final episode. They probably could have been better implemented here, methinks. Ultimately though, I think this is a fairly decently established premise, and there are many cool ways in which the Doctor could potentially interact with it. Yeah, about that. One of the biggest sticks that this serial gets beaten with is the greatly diminished role that the Doctor, Jamie and Zoe have to play in the narrative at large, not just in terms of screen time, but agency too. Not that they have no influence on the adventure at all. In fact, the TARDIS simply arriving indirectly causes the conflict to continue beyond one episode, so you have them to blame for that. But for the most part, their impact on wider events is notably sporadic. They spend most of the runtime as victims of circumstance, often becoming trapped in confined spaces and struggling to problem solve their way out as if they're escape room enthusiasts, and ultimately they just seem largely superfluous in this scenario, assuming a less proactive role than usual as they mainly helplessly tag along with Milo Clancy. This is a major contributing factor to the glacial pacing, because the Doctor and friends' involvement seems to be greatly stunted at every turn. They don't encounter key players in the situation like Cavan or Madeline until essentially the latter half of the serial, and even then only briefly. They don't even appear on screen until 15 minutes into the first episode, which is probably a record. The surviving episode quite infamously isolates them in a room to slowly suffocate for the entire duration, and the Doctor's most direct, hands-on contribution to the entire adventure is defusing the detonator unit in literally the last 10 minutes of the final episode. Now, is any of this necessarily a problem? I mean, it doesn't have to be. This is neither the first or the last time that the Doctor has had a reduced role to play in a story, though it's reasonable to suggest that perhaps, metatextually speaking, this instance is oddly placed. After all, this is the penultimate serial of the Second Doctor's tenure, and he barely has anything to do here. You'd be forgiven for expecting something more involved on our main character's part when they're on the brink of their swan song, but then again, it entirely depends on how it's done, something that Holmes himself would prove with one of his later scripts. As heretical as it sounds, in some ways, the Caves of Androzani ends up being the other side of the coin to what the Space Pirates broadly demonstrates here. That's another story where the Doctor, nearing the end of one of his lives no less, is largely a victim of circumstance in a gritty situation, struggling to influence the actions of other characters and being more concerned with simply getting out alive than solving the local criminal politics. The difference there, however, is that the Caves of Androzani makes that the poignant emotional core of the story, framing the Fifth Doctor's uphill battle to save Peri as the culmination of his wider character arc where he was already struggling with a lack of agency. In the Space Pirates, though, the Doctor and friends' limited involvement isn't really lent that same profundity, which is a shame because there is potential. The Second Doctor is beloved for his on-the-fly trickster manipulation of the situations he finds himself in, how he slyly undermines an opponent that is causing injustice or impeding his goal. A rare situation like this where he seems unable to get a foothold for the most part is actually an intriguing idea, and seeing how that frustration would test him would make for some fascinating storytelling. Ultimately though, it's more that they're just featured in a capacity akin to supporting cast this time around. Perhaps at least partially done to accommodate Troughton, Hines and Padbury's unavailability near the end of production due to location filming for the War Games. And this aspect seems to affect a lot of people's enjoyment. A six-parter is a pretty lengthy span for the Doctor and friends to largely take a back seat, ergo making many folks' investment in the wider scenario very precarious without our time traveller's prominent involvement with it. Now, there's an argument to be made that Milo Clancy is our substitute protagonist here, which makes sense as he's an oddball fish out of water with more narrative prominence. But on top of him proving to be a Marmite character, he isn't introduced until the second episode and then ends up sharing the vast majority of his screen time with the Doctor anyway, who viewers are more likely to gravitate to. And I dare say Hermac's earlier prominence at the start may give an early false impression that he's our main character here. And of course, these circumstances are only further compounded by the subsequent loss of most of the story's footage, making it all the more challenging for many retrospective viewers to connect with these characters, particularly Cavan, as the only episode that survives also happens to be the one episode that he is completely absent from. Oof. That's ultimately what I think causes this general disconnect with the Space Pirates. It already has something of an unorthodox plot that moves much slower than usual and limits our regulars' participation in it, and then when it became a casualty of archival wiping with fairly bare-bones supplemental material to compensate, that turned it into a fortress of unengagement for many people, which may render it completely irredeemable if you subscribe to the notion that being boring is the worst cardinal sin Doctor Who could commit. And that's a shame because yes, its pacing is far from fine-tuned, its plot could be better structured, but I do think Holmes still delivers some pretty decent stuff here. The setup and characters are actually relatively well done. Even our leads still have fun interactions in spite of their reduced roles. Who knows, maybe there will be something of a moderate re-evaluation if the serial ever gets recovered or animated, though I wouldn't expect a night and day transformation in consensus like with The Enemy of the World, not in a million years. Oh yeah, I did animate that drawing pin scene, didn't I? I forgot about that. Man, I really should get back to animating sometime. So, would I still say that this is the worst of Robert Holmes or the Second Doctor? You know what? I'm not entirely sure that I would anymore. I mean, it's still fairly lower tier for both of them, but, I mean, I'd probably still take it over the two Doctors. Look, one of them has Season 6B and the other one doesn't. I don't know what to tell you. Apple actually tastes so fucking good.